The Diary of a Certified Psychopath. 26th of September, 2021. Fuel for thought. By formal, if somewhat paradoxical definition, this was my first officially recreational ride in several weeks, meaning no associated errands nor backpack full of consumerized commodities, except for the small carrier bag of groceries that almost trapped itself in my spokes during a final wind-assisted dash home along Old Fort Road. This afforded me the perfect opportunity to get pointlessly flustered about almost every minor inconvenience, which magnifies itself tenfold when all you're concerned about is cramming a recurring quota of miles into a limited time frame. The unruly west-southwesterly that forced me into a contorted hunch from the very first pedal stroke is so consistently prevalent around these parts that complaining of its presence or effects would be to grumble that the inside of an industrial baking furnace was a tad toasty. So, let's begin with the logjam around Shoreham Roundabout, the third in as many days, and no doubt a consequence of the increasingly disrupted dearth of fuel conveyance, leading to mile-long tailbacks of paranoid motorists queuing up at filling stations across the UK. Negatives into positives, I resolved. My frequent habit of detouring around the airport is worth at least an extra mile, though this fleeting motivation led to further discontent at a cluster of cars blocking my entry to the applicable slip road. After weaving my disgruntled way through a succession of boots and bumpers and down the road in question, I sensed another vehicle closing in behind me, owing mainly to the unmistakable sound of agitated engine revving. It's no good, I mused in morose resignation, wishing the occupant could hear my thoughts as we approached the first of several sleeping policemen. It's the same insufferably tedious routine every time. I let you pass, you slow to a walking pace at every subsequent speed bump, then cross paths with another driver in a tunnel, the tunnel I have cycled through no fewer than 5,000 times, and I can tell you, barely has width enough for two bikes, let alone a pair of adjacent SUVs, before having a 10-minute committee meeting with your newfound nemesis about who is going to give way. Feeling the heat from my pursuer's radiator, I accelerated over the terminally off-duty constables, suffering superfluous ambient bodily harm and almost triggering the collision protection lock on my Di2's rear derailleur to automatically engage. Sure enough, as I passed through that tunnel for the umpteenth occasion, the broad bonnet of a Land Rover Discovery rounded the bend to enter it, prompting an inward utterance of the phrase, "Told you so." The residual resentment of this toxic experience amounted to me regarding my own silhouette and noting a high-frequency flappage of moisture-wicking fabric around the sleeves, collar and waist, knowing all along that the resulting resistance would terminally attenuate my speed, and equally cognizant that all those weekend warriors who shelled out for the latest in skin-tight aero-optimized shrink-wrap would be handed an inherent performance advantage, even before that obtained from 3 hours of shameless wheel-sucking. This accumulation of petty complaints caused me to push a tad harder than has been my recent form up nearly every climb, in the hope that all those sporting extravagant synergies of frictionless frame sets and deep section wheels would, ironically, have nowhere to hide in the hills, or that the savagely steep gradients of Devil's Dyke would, even more ironically, cause gravity to level the proverbial playing field and afford my segment times a modicum of credibility. Keen to establish if my hypothesis held enough water to fill a hummingbird's bathtub, my first action upon arriving home was to check my iPhone, only to discover that the battery was flat. The 27th of September, 2021. Heads I win, tails you lose. Well, that's certainly how it felt throughout this bitter battle of attrition against screaming Lord South. The result of a literal coin toss was not what ultimately persuaded me, perhaps temporarily, to flip to my outwardly nocturnal schedule and put tyre to tarmac before daylight roused the rest of humanity, but rather the mounting pressure of a self-imposed pilgrimage that is becoming increasingly difficult to fulfill during conventional hours, partly due to obligations of a kind that can't be accounted for within errand-based rides, and also the imminent likelihood of cycling's three foremost spoilers, wind, rain, and traffic, conspiring to render real-life miles of any pace and discipline irrevocably disenchanting. Whilst I've harboured a perpetual scepticism towards the prophecies of our climate preachers ever since Michael Fish uttered the now infamous phrase, "Don't worry, there isn't," even without biblical torrents or gales off the Beaufort scale, the slightest prospect of having to scramble along a coast crammed with frantic fuel-craving commuters forming queues longer than those observed outside of Pop Festival Portaloo is deterring enough to warrant decisive and dramatic evasive action. Moreover, logging into Zwift and being presented with 3 sparsely populated virtual worlds, coupled with a schedule full of nothing but hit-based group workouts and the notion of a dozen data overlays serving as a demolishing reminder of just how aerobically inept you are at the crack of dawn on a blue Monday morning, evoked a similar void of enthusiasm. As to how this perilous voyage unfolded, foxes screaming like banshees from deep within the surrounding woodland, rabbits scampering to safety by the moon's silvery light, and, from a purely elemental perspective, rarely has the wind been friend then foe on so many occasions within the space of 90 minutes. Until Stenning I was its captain, from Washington I was its punch bag. The uplifting waltz to the seafront throughout Worthing's upper suburbs that I surfed in triumphant delight as recently as last week became a brutal march through blustery purgatory, and as arduous as I can recall for over a year. And once all was tossed and blown, almost never have I felt so barbarically breeze-battered when collapsing back to bed, hearing sheets of rain begin to hiss down my window, and pondering how on earth I will creatively and coherently conclude this log entry.